and new. It's from Church Anew, and we are going to delve into questions about in-between times. We are living in between times, and one of the things that we want to talk about is that our church, First Presbyterian Church of Fort Thomas, is going through in-between times, and the rest of the churches in our nation are too, as we're coming out of pandemic. But one of the things that we want to do this summer is to listen to different theologians and different people and hear stories from Scripture that speak to us about things that are old and familiar, and also things that we are experiencing as new and mysterious, and things that God might be calling us into. We're going to hear stories of Scripture from Genesis, reflections on these passages, and we'll have time together as a community to ponder, and we'll think about the old and the new that we're facing. The first story that we are dealing with this summer is the story that deals with the push and pull of the old and the new in the book of Genesis from the fall, the creation and fall. And Genesis 3. And after Adam and Eve decide to eat some fruit, we have some consequences. Now, we're going to hear some reflections online from me, and the folks who are in worship are going to hear reflections from Reverend Mehta, who is from Minneapolis. So Reverend Mehta tells a similar story. She lives in Minneapolis, and there's a playground where there's a fence, and I live in Wyoming, like you know, and when I drive down to Fort Thomas, I have to pass by the corner of Galbraith and Vine Street. And on one of the corners of that four-way intersection, there is a playground that has a chain link fence too. It is really good that there's a fence there, because there are lots of cars and a lot of traffic, 4 lanes of traffic, 2 lanes each way, and it's a 4-way intersection. And there are lots of kids there. And I think about how awful it would be if there wasn't a fence. All of the parents there would be really nervous. They would be constantly telling their kids, don't go by the street, don't go by the sidewalk. And the people who are driving would have to be super careful too. And so with that boundary, with that chain link fence, there's security for the kids, the parents, and the cars. I know that as I drive by, I am really grateful that there's a fence there, because I can relax a little bit and know small people are not going to dart out into the intersection. And so we think about boundaries, and I think that we can begin to think about them as a sign of good and healthy love. Boundaries help us to keep things moving smoothly and keep things flowing the way that they're intended. And it's all good. In fact, that's the way God created things in the beginning. God created things and said, this is good. God created and said, this is good. God said, that's good. Everything God created, God called good. Now, God did not say, well, that's perfect. Well, that's exceptional. That is absolutely what I planned perfectly. I think perfection is one of our hang-ups. I don't think that is something that God intended for us. And so I think that in God's desire and design in creation was to make things good, and God provided enough. I think that when we get involved, sometimes we get focused on perfection. In the midst of everything that is so good, we get focused on more instead of enough. And so I think that back to that story of the garden, in that place where God provided so many yeses, you may eat of all of these trees, you can have the run of this place, all of the things that God said, these are for you. There was one no, one boundary. And that's when the serpent showed up and said to Adam and Eve, said, doesn't that look tasty? Aren't you curious about why God doesn't want you to eat of that tree? Don't you want to know why God said no? And I have to say that Eve and Adam both wanted answers to those questions, and I have to confess, I want to know things too. I have always been a nerd. I'm a studious person. I like to read. I like to know things. And so I love being able to have my phone and being able to look things up and know answers and all of those kind of things. I like to know, and I like to be right. I like to fact check things. And recently, my spiritual director challenged me and said, Amy, how important is it to you to be right? And how important is it to you to depend on yourself? And how much do you trust God? And I thought, whoa, that's quite a question. And I didn't have an answer right away. And so she's challenged me to journal about that. And I think that that's a good question for all of us. I think for Adam and Eve, the question was, do you trust God? Do you trust that God has the best intentions for you? And if you trust God, can you trust that this boundary that's been set is for the best? That's a really important question. And can you trust that what you've been provided is enough? And so all of those things are really good questions for us to ponder as well. I think the other thing that I think about sometimes is that if everything God made in creation is good, and God made me, I must be good too. And when I try to present an image of perfection, I'm actually not being honest. And I'm actually feeling a little bit like maybe somebody's going to find out that I'm not perfect, which is kind of ridiculous because I'm not perfect. And of course people are going to find out. And so I get caught up in this trap. And so remembering that good is what God created and good is what God desires is an important thing for me. I remember when my kids were little, I wanted to throw the perfect birthday party or be the perfect mom. And sometimes I still get stuck in those things. And I have to remember that just being good enough is good enough. And I also have to remember that, like Adam and Eve, I mess up. And I will tell all of you that as our church is going forward, we will mess up. We are experimenting, and with experiments come failure. But I also know that when Adam and Eve messed up, that they faced the consequences of their poor choices, but at the same time, God still went with them. They had to face the consequences, but God did not abandon them. And I think this is the difference between reading scripture prescriptively and descriptively. And so I think it's important for us to remember that when God shows up in the garden and Adam and Eve are wearing clothes and they're hiding from God, it's easy for God to see what's gone on. There's only really one rule. So when things aren't as they should be, it's kind of easy for God to figure out, oh, I think I know what happened. The reason that we hear different stories after the fact is that some of us read scripture a little differently. And let me give you an example of that. A prescriptive reading of scripture says God is angry and God is upset that Adam and Eve have eaten this fruit. And so God says, I'm going to punish you because I'm angry. I am going to send you out of this garden, and you are going to have to struggle for the rest of your lives. Just that's the way it is. And that's the way I'm going to make it happen. And a descriptive reading says, well, you all have messed up. And that was not my plan for you. And I'm sad about that because I created this lovely place for you to live. This is why we can't have nice things, right? And God says, well, I'm sorry you're going to have to learn how to work and experience pain, but that was your choice. You wanted to know the things. And so, as much as it grieves me, I'm going to have to let you go and experience these things. But I'm not going to let you do it alone. I am going to go with you. And that's the descriptive reading of Scripture. And in a way, that's what God is saying to us too. We're not going into the future alone. God goes with us. God isn't punishing us. God is saying, I'm going with you. I'm excited for your future. I'm leading you. I am going to provide what you need. It may not seem abundant to you, but it will be enough. So I want you to know that as we face our future as First Presbyterian Church, God is not going to abandon us. We can go through a lot of changes, and we may be wondering if the choices we make are the right choices. But I promise you, whether we make the right choices or good enough choices, God is going to be in the midst, and God will be with us. Your elders and I are praying, and we are working hard, and we are working to help the church prepare for the future that God is calling us into. So please remember the promises that we hear in this piece of Scripture, Genesis 3. God made things and called them good. God made you and called you good. You are enough, and God will provide enough. And God goes